A fallen emperor watches the shoreline from a quiet island. Far across the sea, the great powers of Europe shift uneasily. In the hush before dawn, 1,000 soldiers sleep beneath canvas, unaware their dreams will be swept into history. The year is 1815, and though the cannons have been silent for a time, the world holds its breath. Tonight, we drift gently into the final chapter of an extraordinary rise and fall, a story of stillness before change, of quiet marches, distant thunder, and soft footsteps on a path that leads to Waterloo. Welcome to Sleepy Journeys, the podcast designed to lull you into a peaceful slumber with soothing stories through time, places, and ideas. Whether you're winding down after a long day or simply looking for a peaceful escape, you're in the right place. My name's Jack, and I'm so happy to have you here with me. Each night on Sleepy Journeys, we set off together on gentle adventures designed to soothe your mind and ease you into rest. You'll find journeys through history, comforting fairy tales, myths and folklore, the wonders of science, fascinating inventions, inspiring famous figures, music history, and even calm explorations around the world. No matter where your curiosity takes you, there's a dreamy Sleepy Journeys show for you. Tonight, we're going to embark on a gentle journey through Napoleon's fall at Waterloo. And just before we fully drift off, if you're enjoying Sleepy Journeys, go ahead and tap follow or subscribe on whatever platform you're joining me on. That way, you won't miss any of our upcoming sleepy adventures. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us. Now, take a deep breath and let's begin. Close your eyes if they aren't already. Imagine a soft morning light stretching over distant hills, where the mist hangs gently like a thin shawl over green fields. The year is 1815, and the world, still sleepy from a long stretch of conflict, is on the cusp of yet another change. There is a hush in the air, one that hangs like the pause before a summer storm, holding its breath in a timeless stillness. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of hoofbeats thuds softly against the damp earth, muffled by the dew-covered grass. A steady rhythm against the slumbering heartbeat of the continent. In this journey, we'll drift slowly through the events that led to one of the most defining moments in European history, the Battle of Waterloo. We'll move quietly through landscapes and memories, pausing in the quiet halls of Elba, where a fallen emperor once walked alone in thought. We'll watch the sun rising over a field soon to be filled with soldiers, as if we were just leaves drifting down beside them, unseen and untouched. There's a softness to this kind of history, one that's not often spoken of in books or films. It's the quiet resolve in a general's gaze before dawn. The way wind brushes through the tents of men who sleep deeply, unaware of what the next day might bring. The sigh of a pen against parchment as alliances are written or broken. As we journey deeper into this moment in time, we'll glide past generals and foot soldiers alike as quiet observers. We'll experience a gently painted portrait of 1815 and feel the pulse of history in the gentle hush of its passing. So rest easy. Let the echoes of hoofbeats become the rhythm of your breath. Let the flickering torchlights fade into stars above a darkened plain. The world is changing in this story, but your place in it is safe, peaceful, and still. On the tranquil island of Elba, the days arrived gently, like small boats rocking in a sunlit harbor. The wind carried the scent of citrus and brine, mingling with the warm whisper of Mediterranean tides that touched the shoreline with a rhythm as old as time. Here, far from the stormy heart of Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte moved through his days in near solitude, a man once crowned by thunder, now surrounded by quiet. Elba was a landscape of rolling hills and olive groves, sun-drenched and slow. The birds called softly from twisted fig trees, and the sky above was vast, a soft blue brushed with drifting wisps of white. In the small gardens Napoleon tended himself, the soil yielded lavender, rosemary, and thyme, herbs that, when pinched between fingers, released a comforting scent into the warm island air. He would walk often in the early morning, when the dew still clung to petals and the world felt half asleep. His footfalls along gravel paths were measured and slow, with the patience of one who has too much time to think. A simple coat often replaced the old grandeur of imperial regalia, and a broad-brimmed hat shielded his eyes as he looked out over the hills. These walks were solitary, yet not joyless. There was a softness to this exile, a chance to rest, if only in body. Within the modest rooms of his island residence, papers and maps still lay unfurled, as if waiting to be studied. But here they gathered dust. The ink dried more slowly, and the pens rested in stillness. Occasionally, Napoleon would sit at his desk and gaze toward the sea, where distant sails would pass like drifting dreams, coming and going with no message for him. The salt breeze crept through the shutters and made the curtains dance lazily across the floor. There were visitors from time to time. Couriers with news, islanders with offerings, soldiers who had followed him even to this remote edge of empire. Their voices were quiet, respectful, yet carried a note of hope or longing for something greater than this gentle retreat. And in the evenings, when lanterns flickered and shadows grew long, the emperor would dine with a few trusted companions, laughter rising in hushed tones that barely disturbed the peace. Nightfall in Elba was particularly tender. Stars blanketed the sky, and the chirp of crickets and distant waves made up the only music. The world slowed further, as if holding space for dreams. And somewhere within that calm, beneath the still exterior, a thought stirred, quiet but insistent, that his story was not yet finished. That stillness, no matter how sweet, was not the shape of destiny. Elba, for all its gentleness, was merely a breath between chapters. And as the moonlight glinted off the gentle surf below, the man who once ruled continents lay in bed, eyes open, watching the dance of shadows on the ceiling. Listening. Waiting. In the hush of early March, beneath skies tinged with the pale gold of departing winter, sails were raised quietly along the Elban coast. The sea was calm, almost indulgent, offering little resistance as a small flotilla pulled away from the island's embrace. Aboard the lead vessel stood Napoleon, his gaze fixed on the unseen roads that stretched across France, paths he would soon tread once more. The Eagle, once grounded, had begun its silent ascent. The voyage across the Mediterranean was smooth, kissed by temperate winds and blessed with clear skies. The ships glided through gentle swells, and though few spoke openly of their purpose, Every creak of timber and flap of canvas seemed to hum with anticipation. Yet even this return began with the soft murmur of waves, the whisper of destiny returning with feathered wings. They landed near Golfe Juan, a quiet cove with sleepy waters and a hush that suited the moment. No armies greeted them, only rolling hills, soft with spring green and birdsong that fluttered down from awakening branches. From there, Napoleon and his small company, just over 1,000 men, began the long walk north, a path paved with memory and reputation. Villages along the route stirred slowly as word spread. It crept gently into hearts and homes like morning mist. "He is back," they whispered. "The emperor walks again." Some wept. Some laughed. Most simply watched, wide-eyed, as the man from stories and battlefields passed through their towns with a kind of reverent humility. Each step was quiet, yet monumental. In one village, a farmer offered fresh bread, wrapped still in its baking warmth. In another, a young girl handed him a bundle of violets, shy and serious. To each, Napoleon offered a nod, a smile, or a kind word, not as a ruler returning to power, but as a man returned to his people. The army sent to stop him never fired a shot. Near Laffrey, a dramatic moment unfolded with stillness. Facing down a line of soldiers sent by the king, Napoleon stepped forward alone. He opened his coat slowly, baring his chest to the rifles aimed at him. "If any among you would shoot your emperor," he said softly, "here I am." A beat passed. Then, rifles lowered, and with a rising wave of cheers, the soldiers ran to him as children to a father, long lost. From that moment, the path to Paris unfurled like a dream. The barriers melted. The king fled. By the 20th of March, Napoleon entered the capital to the sound of papal gathering, calling, echoing a name that had once shaken empires. It was a reunion between a figure and a nation, still bound together by the remnants of something powerful and unfinished. The eagle had flown again, a silent arc across a sleeping sky, returning to roost on familiar soil. In the heart of Vienna, grand chandeliers shimmered above polished parquet floors, their crystal arms casting soft rainbows that danced across ceiling frescoes. The Congress of Vienna had gathered in the wake of Napoleon's first abdication, a great conclave of kings, princes, diplomats, and ministers assembled to reshape Europe like careful gardeners tending a sprawling, unruly hedge. Maps lay open across velvet-draped tables. Pens scratched quietly. Tea cooled in delicate porcelain cups. And for a time, there was a fragile sense of order settling like dust upon a museum's frame. It was January of 1815, and snow fell in soft drifts over the city, muffling footsteps and dampening voices. Within warm halls, the leaders of Europe moved in a choreography of debate and diplomacy. Outside, Vienna bustled with its usual grace, unaware that beneath the calm, the world's future was being drawn in ink and silence. And then came a tremor, a ripple through the parchment calm. Whispers first, then letters, then confirmation. Napoleon had returned. The news reached the Congress like a hush that steals the warmth from a room, even when the fire still burns. Men paused mid-sentence. Quills stopped mid-stroke. For a moment, the grand endeavor of peace, so intricately woven, seemed to unravel at its very edges. The eagle had flown from Elba, and in doing so, scattered their careful plans like autumn leaves in a gust of wind. Across the city, candles flickered in drafty halls as hurried meetings were called to preserve the world. What followed was a shift in weight, as if every man in that Congress felt the sudden presence of a familiar shadow at their shoulder. It was a ghost from recent memory, returned with living breath. The Congress, once aimed at balance and borders, pivoted toward urgency. The coalition that had formed to end the Napoleonic Wars, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, now regrouped in thought, gathering again their resolve for war. And yet, they did so with an air of weariness, like old dancers recalling once mastered steps. Still, Vienna continued to glow. Its streets, brushed with snow, remained lovely in the evening light. Couples strolled. Musicians played. But behind the curtains of embassies and palaces, the ink flowed faster. Seals were pressed with firmer hands. And in the margins of once optimistic documents, the scribbles of urgency began to grow. Peace had been a dream, beautiful, fleeting, and now postponed. Napoleon's return had not just disrupted the Congress. It had awakened an entire continent. As spring crept gently across the European countryside, melting the last snows and softening the earth beneath bare trees, a quiet kindling took place across kingdoms and capitals. News of Napoleon's return, once a whisper, had grown into certainty, and with it came the slow, deliberate movement of old alliances returning to life. It began in sitting rooms and council chambers, in the shuffle of boots down palace corridors, in the silent handshakes exchanged beneath chandeliers. The great powers, long wary of each other, now turned to a familiar purpose, to gather once more against the man who had upended the continent with dreams and drums. And so, across Europe, letters were penned in resolve. Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia all had tasted the long years of war. All had endured the upheavals of empire. Now they joined together again, with arms and a shared sigh. The Seventh Coalition, as it would quietly be called, was born. In London, the mood was brisk and businesslike. The cobblestone streets echoed with carriage wheels, and inside government halls, strategies were drafted with calm precision. The British, under the command of the Duke of Wellington, prepared for another chapter in a long saga they thought concluded. There was no revelry, only readiness, steady and sure. In Vienna, the Congress became a war room. Though the music still played and the lights still glowed in ballrooms, the atmosphere had shifted. Diplomats left earlier in the evening. Their smiles were thinner and their eyes more tired. Yet there was unity in the fatigue, an understanding that this final campaign would be waged in concert. Russia's commitment came with the vastness of its land, a steady tide of troops drawn from deep forests and icy fields. The Tsar, Alexander, pledged his support with a quiet nod. His empire, distant and enormous, moved slowly but with weight. In Prussia, old wounds stirred. Their generals still remembered Jena, remembered the long shadow Napoleon had cast. And so, with stoic discipline, they assembled once again, their soldiers emerging from winter like branches thick with the promise of bloom. Together, these powers agreed upon a singular purpose: to raise armies, to meet the threat, and to ensure, gently, firmly, that no single man would again wield such unmatched power. Yet even in this, there was no hatred. Only duty, worn like an old coat. The men who led these efforts did so with the calm of seasoned watchmen, their eyes turned toward the horizon with the steadiness of resolve. And so the coalition formed with quiet efficiency. Maps were laid out again. Roads were marked. Messages dispatched. Drums still lay silent, but their cadence had begun in the minds of men who had seen too much to forget and remembered enough to act. As the last frost faded from the fields and the larks returned to sing in budding trees, Europe once again prepared. And the paths these nations traced would soon converge in one soft green place, a little village in Belgium called Waterloo. As spring settled across France, it painted the landscape with quiet renewal. The rivers, swollen from melting snows, ran clearer now, and fields softened beneath the warming sun. In the distance, birds called gently from hedgerows, and trees unfurled their new leaves with slow grace. Amid this gentle backdrop, plans were made with the deliberate care of a man who knew how quickly the wind could shift. Napoleon moved through these days with a calm intensity. The air around him was hushed, as if the world itself recognized the delicate weight of what lay ahead. His headquarters, set in modest surroundings, was a hive of silent preparation. Men came and went with folded orders. Boots echoed softly in hallways. Oil lamps burned through long evenings, casting warm glows over ink-stained hands and creased maps. In the morning, the scent of damp earth and turned soil filled the air. Soldiers woke slowly, stretching beneath canvas tents, their breath rising like smoke in the cool dawn. Some cleaned their weapons with practiced care. Others mended boots or polished buttons. But most simply sat in the grass, warming their hands on tin cups of coffee, gazing out across the horizon as if they might glimpse the path ahead written in the haze. These men, many veterans, some young recruits, were held together by a quiet solidarity. They didn't know the name of Waterloo yet, nor the scale of what would come. But they sensed it, in the stillness, in the way their commanders moved with greater focus, and in the presence of the man they called emperor. Napoleon visited the troops often. He would pass down lines of resting soldiers, his coat flaring slightly in the breeze, his hands behind his back. A nod here, a word there. And though his words were few, they landed like anchors, grounding the moment in shared resolve. Logistics filled the hours between inspection and rest. Carts were loaded, supplies measured, horses fed and brushed until their coats shone. The army, though small by earlier standards, moved with the precision of a single body, one taught by hard years and careful discipline. And through it all, the roads to Belgium were traced again and again on parchment, lines looping through villages and forested lanes, threading toward destiny. At night, fires dotted the hillsides like scattered stars. Men hunched close to the warmth, telling stories in low voices of homes and seasons past. The crackling flames lent a rhythm to their words, and above them, the sky opened wide and silent, a dark canvas brushed with moonlight. There was no rush in these final days before the march. Only readiness, slow and steady. The calm before motion. The hush before history. The air in mid-June carried the fragrance of damp grass and wildflowers. Fields swayed gently beneath the early summer sun, their tall blades catching the breeze like waves on a calm sea. In this peaceful countryside, where birds flitted above hedges and streams wandered lazily through the earth, the first ripples of conflict began to unfold, soft at first, like distant murmurs on the wind. On June 16th, in the sleepy villages of Ligny and Quatre Bras, the stillness of morning gave way to movement. Along narrow roads bordered by poplar trees, columns of troops passed like shadows, silent, alert, steady. Their coats brushed softly against branches, their boots left wet impressions in the soil. They carried the quiet seriousness of those who understood what might await. Ligny, nestled near a stream with stone cottages and quiet lanes, awoke to more than birdsong. The Prussian army, under Marshal Blücher, had taken up position here, their formations spread across fields now touched with tension. The wind tugged gently at banners. Officers leaned over maps on the backs of horses, voices low, gestures slow and measured. Opposite them, Napoleon observed with his usual calm. He stood atop a ridge, his telescope steady in one gloved hand, the other tucked behind his back. The landscape before him seemed pastoral, even idyllic, and yet, beneath its surface, history began to stir. The Battle of Ligny broke out with the percussion of musketry and the roll of cannon, sounds that rose and fell like distant thunder. Smoke drifted upward in languid spirals, blurring the line between sky and field. Horses whinnied gently, men moved like pieces on a living chessboard. Though the Prussians fought with courage, they could not hold. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the countryside, Napoleon's forces pressed through. Victory at Ligny was quiet and fleeting. It bore no triumph, only the ache of progress made too late. Meanwhile, to the west at Quatre Bras, the Anglo-Dutch forces under the Duke of Wellington faced the French in a parallel dance. The fields here, too, were green and wide, bordered by woods and low stone walls. In the distance, farms stood like sentinels, their windows glinting under the afternoon light. The battle here unfolded with scattered bursts, engagements that ebbed and flowed like gusts of wind across an open plain. Soldiers emerged from the woods like apparitions, clashing briefly before fading back into the tree line. Drums beat in the distance, their rhythm broken by the terrain. By nightfall, neither side had gained ground nor lost it fully. The fields lay hushed again, marked by the silence of those who waited for what would come next. And across both battlefields, as the stars appeared one by one in the vast night sky, a breath seemed to pass over the land, as if the earth itself sighed, aware that this was only the beginning. Night settled gently over the hills near Waterloo, laying a soft velvet hush across the fields. The last rays of sunlight clung briefly to the tops of trees before slipping away, and the sky unfurled into a deepening canvas of dusk. Overhead, stars blinked to life one by one, like distant lanterns lit in ceremony, quiet and patient. In Napoleon's camp, the mood was still. Fires dotted the rolling landscape, flickering like embers scattered by some unseen hand. Soldiers gathered in small groups, their forms hunched in the firelight, eyes reflecting the glow as they shared bread, warmth, and silence. The air held a faint scent of smoke, mixed with damp earth and the faint sweetness of nearby blossoms stirred by the breeze. The murmur of conversation drifted in low waves, never rising above a whisper. Words passed between friends and brothers in arms. Of memories, of home, of laughter, of spring mornings on quiet roads. Some fiddled with buttons or carefully folded letters, worn soft from too much reading. Others leaned back on their packs, gazing skyward, letting the constellations carry them somewhere far away. Napoleon himself, though rarely resting, moved quietly through the camp earlier that evening. His steps were measured, his presence familiar but subdued. He spoke little, merely observing, watching his men as lives held in balance. He studied the faces lit by firelight, the quiet gestures of preparation, and the long shadows stretching across the grass. Inside his command tent, the air was calm. Maps lay folded. Orders had already been given. Candles burned low, their wax trailing like the hours. He sat for a time at a small desk, the silence around him unbroken except for the occasional rustle of fabric or the distant call of a night bird. Perhaps he thought of the campaign, of the angles, the terrain, the timetables, or perhaps of other nights, years ago, when Europe had felt just as still, and he just as alone. Outside, the wind slipped between the tents like a wandering spirit. Horses nickered gently in the dark, and the sound of boots on soft ground echoed faintly as sentries passed by. Everything was in motion, yet nothing hurried. The world waited. There was a timelessness in that night, a feeling that it had unfolded many times before, in other places, for other men. A night before change, before the pages of history would turn once more. And within it, every heartbeat, every breath, seemed to move just a little more slowly, as if the earth itself were holding time in its hands. The camp at Waterloo did not sleep easily, but it rested, wrapped in the quiet cloak of expectation. And above it all, the sky watched, ancient, vast, and still. Across the fields from Napoleon's camp, beneath the same velvet sky, the Allied forces under the Duke of Wellington also lay in quiet repose. Their fires glowed with the same flickering light. Their tents rose and fell in the breeze like rows of resting sails. And yet, the feeling in the air, while similar in hush, carried its own rhythm, one of steadiness, of calm control threaded with thoughtful caution. The British and their allies, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops among them, were gathered along the ridge at Mont Saint-Jean. The earth beneath them was damp but firm, and the surrounding landscape lay open and broad, rolling gently into the darkness. From the higher ground, the camp looked down over fields now cloaked in starlight, a terrain that by morning would become something else entirely. But that moment had not yet arrived. For now, there was only stillness. Within the Allied camp, the atmosphere was subdued but organized. Tents stood in disciplined lines, and the men moved about their duties with quiet familiarity. Horses were checked, boots dried near fires, uniforms brushed with slow hands. Everything was done without rush, the mark of a force used to waiting. The Duke of Wellington, known for his composure, spent the evening as he often did, reviewing plans, walking among his officers, and offering reassurance in a tone that never wavered. His presence, even in silence, brought steadiness. In a small farmhouse that served as his temporary headquarters, candles cast a warm glow over simple furnishings. Maps were consulted, notes exchanged in hushed voices. But as the night deepened, even these tasks slowed. Wellington dined plainly, speaking little. He knew the hours ahead would stretch long, and that the outcome rested in how well the waiting had been done. Outside, soldiers sat in loose circles near their fires, passing the time as one does when time itself feels paused. Some told old stories, others played cards by lantern light, the flick of paper and the murmurs of laughter rising gently into the night. A few sat alone, their thoughts drifting like smoke upward into the sky, their minds perhaps on fields far from Belgium. Here, too, sleep came lightly. Blankets were pulled tighter. Helmets rested nearby. Yet even in rest, there was no fear, only the awareness that tomorrow would ask much of them, and tonight must offer what quiet it could. The breeze moved softly through the trees, rustling branches and bending grass. Somewhere nearby, an owl called out, low and distant. And beneath that starlit dome, two armies, separated by field and fate, waited together in silence. On this night, the world held still. And for those who stood watch, every heartbeat echoed the same gentle truth, that the dawn, though hidden, was already on its way. Morning arrived with a gentle unveiling of the sky. The fields of Waterloo emerged slowly from darkness, bathed in a low mist that drifted just above the earth like a breath held in stillness. The dew lay thick on blades of grass, catching the first light of dawn and turning it to silver. Trees stood quiet and motionless, their limbs reaching out like silent witnesses to the day's awakening. The air was cool, almost damp, and the ground underfoot was soft with the moisture of the previous night's rain. Mud clung to boots and wagon wheels alike, slowing every step, muffling sound. It was as though nature herself had drawn a veil over the landscape, making time stretch and slow. In the Allied lines, soldiers roused themselves quietly. There was no call to arms, no shouted commands, only the shuffling of feet, the clinking of metal, and the creak of leather straps being fastened. Breakfasts were simple and brief. Eyes looked forward, toward the ridge where the French would come, yet few spoke. Words seemed unnecessary in that gray light. Wellington, composed as ever, moved among his officers with a calm demeanor. His tone remained measured. He adjusted placements, confirmed orders, nodded silently to men he had come to know. His command post, positioned just behind the ridge at Mont Saint-Jean, provided a vantage sheltered from direct fire, yet perfectly suited to observe the movements to come. Across the field, the French lines stirred under the same quiet sky. Bonaparte, already up and surveying the terrain, stood with his marshals. The village of La Haye-Sainte lay ahead, nestled in the center of the battlefield, its stone walls and orchard already studied in great detail. Hougomont, off to the right, stood silent, its high walls waiting to play their part in the unfolding day. The French army, though outnumbered by the combined Allied forces and Prussian reinforcements yet to arrive, moved with practiced confidence. Artillery was positioned with care, wheels secured on soft ground. Infantry lined up in columns, bayonets gleaming faintly as the mist began to thin. Drummers stood ready but silent, their sticks poised for the first roll. At around 11 in the morning, the first cannon fire split the air, heavy, like a slow heartbeat starting to rise. It echoed across the valley, startling a flock of birds into the sky. Then came another, and the rhythm of battle, though still sparse, began to form. Yet even in this moment, there was no rush. The battlefield was a stage, carefully prepared, slowly filling with figures. The day had begun, not with chaos, but with choreography. And under the steadily brightening sky, the mist lifted at last, revealing the contours of the land, the men who stood upon it, and the long shadows they cast toward one another. As the morning passed into midday, the landscape of Waterloo changed. What had been quiet fields and soft hills became etched with movement and echo. The air thickened with smoke, rolling and pale like steam rising from an early spring river. The sky above remained calm, clouds drifting slowly, as if unaware of the shifting world below. Now the battle's rhythm quickened. From the French right, Hougoumont stood firm like a fortress in miniature. High stone walls and clustered trees gave shelter to British guards who defended with silent resolve. Skirmishes flared around its orchard and garden walls. The French pushed again and again, but the defenders did not yield. The fighting here was constant, yet it unfolded like a tide-meeting rock, waves of men flowing forward, only to wash back into the woods. Elsewhere, the French center advanced with methodical steps. Infantry in thick columns moved across the open fields, their pace steady, their bayonets a glinting forest of steel. From behind, artillery fired over their heads, the sound deep and distant, a slow, booming roll that traveled across the landscape like thunder across wide plains. The Allied lines set behind the ridge remained composed. Cannon replied in kind, and the smoke mingled in the valley between them, creating a swirling, silver veil. From behind this curtain, muskets spoke in bursts, flashes of light, soft thuds of powder igniting, and then the low sigh of smoke drifting upward. At La Haye-Sainte, the stone farmhouse braced under pressure. French troops surrounded it, searching for an opening, but inside, the King's German Legion held fast. Windows became watchpoints, courtyards turned into ground held by inches. The walls, worn and scarred, did not fall. The fighting was close, quiet in the grand scheme, yet relentless in its focus. As the sun passed its peak and began its slow descent, cavalry thundered onto the field. The French cuirassiers, resplendent in polished breastplates, charged across the valley. Their horses moved like waves of shadow, their hooves drumming a deep, resonant rhythm into the earth. Toward the Allied squares they surged, only to meet walls of bristling bayonets and calm, steady resistance. The British squares stood like islands in the sea, men packed close, silent save for the commands passed calmly down the line. Time slowed here, even as the battle around them quickened. The cavalry wheeled, struck, and rode off. Again they came, and again they were repelled, the silence of the squares never breaking. Over it all, the sky held steady. Wind passed through the grasses, and the trees at the edge of the field swayed gently, untouched by the struggle unfolding below. The light began to change, golden now, softening the shapes of soldiers and shadow. By late afternoon, the field bore the marks of long effort. Earth torn by wheels, grass blackened by powder, uniforms dulled with dust and wear. Yet still, the lines held. Still, the air thrummed with endurance. This was a slow pressure, a weight that built with each hour, each volley, each quiet step forward. And though the outcome remained unwritten, the ground itself seemed to remember, every footfall, every echo, carrying the memory of what was passing through. Evening fell over the fields of Waterloo with a hush that felt older than the hills themselves. The sun, now low and golden, cast long shadows across the torn earth. The cannon had gone quiet. The horses no longer ran. The men, those who remained, stood still in the cooling air, their faces turned toward a sky that now gave no sign of what had passed beneath it. And somewhere, far from the fading sounds of that final volley, Napoleon turned his horse and began to ride. It was a quiet withdrawal, step by step, through the softening light. The emperor, once cloaked in the roar of victory, now wore silence like a mantle. The dust of the road clung to his boots and the hem of his coat. The fields he passed no longer saluted him with cheers, only the gentle swaying of grass and the murmur of wind through distant trees. His carriage followed at a distance, his staff solemn. Their path led south, away from the storm they had not weathered. Along the roads, villagers peered from windows, uncertain whether to wave or turn away. Some offered bread or water. Others simply watched in stillness, as one might observe the last leaf falling from a long-standing tree. As night deepened, stars reappeared in the sky. They were the same stars he had seen on campaign in Italy, in Egypt, in Austerlitz. Once, they had looked down on ambition. Now, they bore witness to reflection. In the days that followed, Napoleon returned to Paris as a man seeking closure. The city, which had once lifted him like a tide, now held its breath. There were no parades, no songs, only quiet corridors, muted council meetings, and rooms where footsteps echoed too loudly. He abdicated again with the calm of someone who knew the shape of endings. This time, there was no island throne, no imperial title. Only a letter, a signature, and the faint rustle of paper being folded and carried away. He hoped, perhaps, to escape to America, to disappear across the ocean like a stone tossed gently into a still lake. But fate, once so tightly held, had slipped beyond his grasp. The British intercepted him. There would be no Elba, no second return. Only St. Helena, a far lonelier place, where the wind howled against volcanic cliffs and the sea spoke only in waves. There, in that distant outpost beneath a foreign sun, Napoleon spent his final years. He gardened. He wrote. He remembered. And as time passed, even the echoes of cannons faded from his dreams. He watched clouds drift across the horizon and birds nest in unfamiliar trees. The world had grown quiet. And in that rest, the shadow of an empire slowly dissolved, like mist in the morning, rising toward a sky that had always been and would always remain unchanged. With Napoleon's retreat and the final silence at Waterloo, a long breath was released across Europe, an exhalation as deep as the continent itself. The air felt different in those days that followed. The weight of years, of revolution, of war, of empire, lifted like morning fog warming in the sun, slowly dissolving from the edges inward. In Paris, bells tolled in solemnity. The streets that had once echoed with chants and marching boots were quiet now, lined with citizens walking slowly, speaking softly. The tricolor still fluttered above buildings, but the air beneath it carried a different feeling. Across the Channel, Londoners read the news by candlelight. Waterloo had arrived as a name, but quickly became a symbol. It spread with quiet understanding. The long struggle had found its end. Families waited for letters. Farmers returned to fields. The River Thames, unchanged in its flow, reflected the new peace with barely a ripple. In Vienna, the Congress resumed its careful work. The ink returned to maps. Borders were redrawn with softer hands. Though disagreement still lived around those tables, it was laced now with relief that the fire had passed, that they were shaping a world from calm. The Prussians, stoic in their victory, returned home with discipline and silence. Their fields, too, waited to be tilled. The long roads unwound behind them as they moved eastward beneath open skies, their uniforms dusty, but their hearts unburdened. And in the countryside of Belgium, the battlefield began its quiet return to earth. Farmers came to reclaim the soil. Grass pushed through trampled ground. Wildflowers appeared near broken fences, their petals opening to the sky without fanfare. Rain came and washed the dust from stones. The crows left. The wind returned to its old paths. Letters were written, some in mourning, others in reflection. Poetry bloomed from pens once dipped in campaign orders. Painters captured the light over La Belle Alliance, the distant ridge, the stillness of an orchard where men once fought. History, slowly, began to take shape, but always with a softness, shaped more by memory than by march. Europe, having held its breath for 2 decades, now found its rhythm again. The Long War, with all its echoes, became something to study, to remember, and eventually to whisper about by firelight. The eagle had flown. The drums had stilled. And though the pages of history continued to turn, this chapter, inked in silence and softened by time, now lay closed beneath a sky as timeless and vast as the peace it now held. The fields of Waterloo are quiet now. Time, in its gentle way, has laid a soft cover of silence over everything that came before. The grass has grown tall again. The breeze moves freely between the trees. And somewhere, beneath a stretch of open sky, a lark calls into the dusk, its song light and clear and unconcerned with the past. As we return from our journey through 1815, through the quiet exile on Elba, the soft unfolding of plans, and the slow rise and fall of a final campaign, let us bring back history's calmest echoes. Picture once more that early spring morning on Elba, when the earth was still damp from winter's touch, and Napoleon walked among lavender and thyme. Hear the hush of waves lapping gently against the shore, and the distant call of a gull above quiet hills. That was the beginning, like the lifting of a curtain before a gentle play. Then remember the slow march through France, where farmers offered bread and violets, and soldiers came forward in quiet recognition. There was no thunder then. Only footsteps, the creak of saddles, and the kind of silence that speaks of something shared. We traveled through Vienna's candlelit halls, past diplomats surprised by war's return. Through the reawakening of alliances, with the careful folding of letters, the sealing of envelopes, and the pressing of maps flat beneath steady hands. And we moved through the fields once more, at Ligny and Quatre Bras, where cannon fire rolled like distant weather, and soldiers stood as men beside one another, doing what must be done beneath a sky that did not judge. At Waterloo, we felt the softness of anticipation, the stillness before movement, the wind through the branches of hougoumont. The thunder came in a gradual deepening, the slow, heavy breath of history turning its next page. And then it faded. Napoleon, once the center of a continent, rode away with dust on his boots and the weight of farewell in his silence. And Europe exhaled. Let that exhale carry you now. Feel it ease across your shoulders, through your chest, into your breath. Let the quiet settle in around you like a blanket. Let the light of that fading sun over Waterloo guide your thoughts to rest. The battle has passed. The world has changed. And still, the sky remains vast, watchful, and kind. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey. I hope it brought you a little peace, a little wonder, and a little closer to rest. Until next time, sweet dreams.